Morning of my father's 65th birthday felt like the kind of day you save up for, not because anything was particularly grand about it yet. It was just a Tuesday in October, the kind where the air smells like wet leaves and coffee and the possibility that things might finally go right. I had been planning the dinner for 4 months. Not because my father asked me to, he would never ask. That's not who he is. My father is the kind of man who spent 31 years working maintenance for the school district, up before 5, home after dark, hands perpetually cracked from cleaning supplies and cold mornings, and somehow never once complained about any of it. Not once. Not to me, not to my mother, not to anyone. When I was 11 and we couldn't afford the field trip to Washington, D.C., he took a Saturday shift without telling me and slipped the check into my backpack the night before the deadline. He just did things. Quietly. Without ceremony. So when he turned 65, I decided the ceremony would come from me. I reserved the private dining room at Hargrove's. It's not a flashy place, no white tablecloths or amuse bouches, but it's warm and it's real and the kind of restaurant where the owner still walks the floor on Friday nights. I'd eaten there with my parents twice before, on occasions that mattered. It felt right. I put down a deposit in August. I spent weeks on the guest list, the menu, the seating. My mother cried when I told her, not dramatically. She just got very still and then her eyes filled up, and she said, "He's going to hate all the attention." And she was right, and we both laughed because that was exactly why it had to happen. My husband Daniel knew about all of it. He had been supportive in the way he usually was, enthusiastic in the early conversations, quieter as the details actually materialized. But I told myself that was just his way. He wasn't a planner. I was. What I didn't know was that his mother had her own plans entirely. I should have seen it earlier. I know that now. I've turned it over enough times in the months since to understand exactly where the fault lines were. But at the time, I was so focused on getting everything right for my father that I kept reclassifying things that should have been alarms as inconveniences. The first sign was 6 weeks before the dinner, when Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother had asked if some of her friends could come. Her friends, I said. Just 2 couples. She says they've been asking to meet your parents for a while. I told him no. I said it nicely, but I said it clearly. This was my father's birthday dinner, not a mixer. He nodded and said he'd let her know. The second sign was 3 weeks out when his mother, her name is Lorraine, called me directly and told me she had a friend who was a wonderful event planner and could help me with the seating arrangements. I thanked her and said I had already handled it. She laughed in that particular way she had and said, "Of course you have, sweetheart." I let it go. I always let things go with Lorraine. Daniel had asked me to, in the beginning, and then at some point it had just become habit. The third sign I chose not to see at all because it came from Daniel himself the week before the dinner when he said his parents were hoping to sit at the main table. "Obviously," I said, "I already have them at the main table." He nodded quickly. Too quickly, I realized later. Like he was relieved by something he hadn't told me. On the night of the dinner, I arrived 40 minutes early. My mother and father weren't there yet. I told them 7, and it was 6:20, and I wanted to be there when they walked in. I wanted to see my father's face when he saw the room. The manager, a kind woman named Miss Torres who had helped me with the booking, met me at the door and walked me back to the private room. She didn't say anything unusual. She just held the door open and stepped aside. I stopped in the doorway. The room was set up beautifully, the lighting was low and warm, and there were flowers on every table. Not the elaborate arrangements I had described when I booked, but something different, something that looked like they had been rearranged. There were 10 tables, and the main table, the long one at the centre with 12 chairs, had place cards laid out carefully. I walked to it. I started reading the cards. Lorraine. My father-in-law, Robert, his sister Janet, her husband, their daughter's husband. 2 names I didn't recognize. Then, at the far end, almost at the corner, my mother's name in a handwriting that wasn't mine. I stood there for a moment. I picked up my mother's card, I turned it over, I set it back down. My father's name wasn't there at all. My seating chart had been completely replaced. The place cards I had made, Cream cardstock, my father's favourite colour, his full name written in the calligraphy my college roommate had done as a favour, were gone. In their place were Lorraine's arrangements. My parents had been moved to a small table near the back corner of the room, a table for four, next to the service door. I asked Miss Torres when this had happened. She looked uncomfortable and told me that a woman had come in around 4 o'clock and said she was handling the final details for the booking. She'd assumed she was with me. I asked her to describe the woman. She did. It was Lorraine. I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, we're about 5 minutes out. Did you know, I said, that your mother came to the restaurant this afternoon and changed my seating chart? A pause that was not short enough to be innocent. She mentioned she wanted to. Daniel. She thought it would be easier for. My father, I said, is not sitting in the corner of his own birthday dinner. Your mother's book club friends do not get the main table at my father's 65th birthday party. That is not what is happening tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know you're upset, but let's just get through tonight, okay? It's one dinner. I heard it then. The exact same thing he had said about the vacation we didn't take because his parents wanted to come. The exact same words he had used about the Christmas that got rerouted to his mother's house without my input. It's one thing. Let's just get through it. Can we not make this a whole situation? I'll see you when you get here, I said. I hung up and stood in the middle of that room for probably 90 seconds. Then I started moving. I took every place card off the main table and set them on the side counter. I found my original seating chart in my bag. I had brought a copy for Ms. Torres, and I reconstructed it from memory. My father at the head, my mother to his right, my aunt and uncle, my parents' two oldest friends, the Daltons, who had driven 3 hours from Columbus for this. My grandmother, who was 81 and had told me twice she might not be up to it, and then showed up anyway at every single thing I'd ever done that mattered. Miss Torres helped me without being asked. She moved quickly and didn't make it strange. I was grateful for that in a way I still think about. My parents arrived at 7 on the dot. My father walked in with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the room the way he always looked at things, assessing, careful, a little suspicious of anything that seemed too good. Then he saw the table. He saw his name at the head of it. He saw my grandmother already seated and waving at him, and his face did the thing it almost never does. He looked overwhelmed. He covered it quickly, the way he always does. He clapped me on the shoulder and said the food better be worth the drive. I told him it was. My mother hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Daniel arrived with his parents 7 minutes later. I watched Lorraine walk into the room and stop at the threshold the same way I had, doing the same inventory I had done. I watched her eyes move to the main table. I watched her face change. She found me across the room. I didn't look away. She crossed me with the particular speed of a woman who has decided something. Robert followed. Daniel lagged slightly behind. I don't understand, she said. Her voice was controlled, but not entirely. I came in earlier to. I know you did, I said. The arrangement I made was not yours to make, I said. This is my father's dinner. My family planned it, my family paid for it, and my family made the seating arrangements. Yours are on the side counter if you'd like to take them home. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. That was the thing I had been waiting to see without knowing I was waiting for it. 14 months of marriage, and at every single inflection point he had gone quiet. Every time I needed him to say no, actually, this isn't okay, he went quiet. I had been telling myself it was conflict avoidance, that he was working on it, that it would change. Standing there watching him study the tablecloth while his mother stared at me, I understood that it wasn't going to change, not because he wasn't capable of it, because he didn't want to. The dinner went forward. Lorraine sat at a table near the window with Robert and the others. It was a nice table. It was not the main table, and she knew that, and it was a fine table regardless. Several people who didn't know what had happened had pleasant conversations with her all evening. She was gracious in public. She was always gracious in public. My father made a toast at the end of the meal. He is not a speech person. He stood up and held his glass and looked around the room and started to say something about how he hadn't expected any of this, and then he stopped and started over. He said, "I've been the luckiest man I know my whole life, and I just never had the words for it." Then he sat back down, and my mother put her hand over his, and my grandmother said loudly that someone needed to bring more bread, and everyone laughed. I held it together until the parking lot. Daniel drove home separately. He had texted me near the end of the evening to say he thought we should talk at home, that it wasn't the place. I wrote back okay. By the time I got in my car, I'd already started understanding that the conversation at home was going to be the same conversation we'd been having for 14 months, and I was tired of it in a way that had moved past frustration into something quieter. He was waiting in the kitchen when I got home. He apologized. Genuinely, I think. He said his mother had overstepped and he should have told me what she was planning. He said he hadn't told me because he knew I'd be upset, and he had hoped it would just work out. He said the words carefully, in the order of someone who had been composing them in the car. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "When she was standing in front of me and you didn't say anything, what were you thinking?" He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't want to make it worse," he said. "For who?" He didn't answer. That was 3 months ago. I've had a lot of time since then to think about what I actually said next. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't throw anything. I just told him that I was done adjusting myself to fit into an arrangement I hadn't agreed to, and that I needed him to understand that I was serious. That this wasn't an ultimatum about his mother. It was a question about whether he saw me, my family, my father, the 31 years of 5 a.m. shifts and cracked hands, as something worth protecting. He said he did. He said he was sorry. He said things would be different. I believed him, partially, the way you believe someone when you can see they mean it in the moment, but you've stopped trusting the moment. We went to marriage counselling. We went 12 times. The therapist was careful and patient and said things that were genuinely useful, and at session 9 she gently observed that one party seemed to have already made a decision and was waiting to feel ready to say it out loud. She was looking at me when she said it. She wasn't wrong. By the time I filed in February, I had already moved most of the practical things. I had already had the conversations with my parents, my father, who listened without interrupting and then asked if I needed anything, same as always, my mother, who cried and then made 2 casseroles and dropped them off without telling me she was coming. What I didn't expect was the thing that happened in early March. I had been tired for 2 weeks in a way that felt specific. I recognized it in a distant, not quite believing way. And then I took a test at 6:30 in the morning in my own bathroom in the apartment I'd moved into in January, and it was positive. I sat on the tile floor for a while. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about my father at 65, standing in the restaurant with his hand over his glass, saying he'd been the luckiest man he knew. I thought about my mother dropping off casseroles without being asked. I thought about what it had taken to raise me. Not money, not connections, not the right table at the right restaurant, just showing up, just doing the quiet thing over and over until it amounted to something. I thought about whether I was going to tell Daniel. I knew in some part of myself that doesn't negotiate what the right thing was. Not because I wanted his involvement, not because it would make anything easier, but because my father had taught me, not in words, never in words, that you don't make unilateral decisions that belong to 2 people, even when one of those people has let you down, even when the easier path would be to simply not say anything and start over clean. I called Daniel on a Wednesday afternoon. I told him directly. I told him I wasn't asking for anything and I wasn't making any promises about what the future looked like, but that he deserved to know. He was very quiet. Then he said, "Okay." Then he said he wanted to be involved if I'd let him. I told him I would think about it. I'm still thinking about it. The due date is July. My father has already started researching car seats, which is the most him thing I've ever seen him do. He sent me a spreadsheet with safety ratings and price comparisons, and a note at the bottom that said, probably overthinking it, my mother is making a quilt. She started it 3 weeks ago and has texted me photographs of the fabric samples with the same intensity she reserves for very little else. I don't know what the rest of it looks like yet. I don't know what Daniel and I will work out or not work out, or what kind of people we'll manage to be to each other on the other side of everything. I'm not someone who's good at not knowing. I've always been better at planning, at booking the room early, at making the place cards myself. But somewhere between October and March, I started to understand that the parts of my life that actually held were never the ones I arranged. They were the ones that showed up anyway, in the form of my father clapping me on the shoulder and saying the food better be worth the drive, in the form of my mother's casseroles left on the doorstep, in the form of a grandmother who said she might not make it and then came to every single thing that mattered. Whatever comes next, I know how to do this part. I learned it from people who never made a speech about it. I just have to keep showing up. I keep coming back to that moment in the parking lot after the dinner. The way the October air felt too cold for how I was dressed, the sound of car doors closing across the lot, the faint noise of the restaurant still going behind me. I wasn't crying. That surprised me at the time. I thought I would be. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity. The uncomfortable kind, the kind that doesn't leave room for negotiation. My father spent 31 years doing the right thing without being asked. No speeches, no receipts, no expectation of credit. He just showed up, over and over, in the cold and in the dark, because that was what the people he loved needed from him. That's not a personality trait. That's a choice, made thousands of times, and thousands of ordinary moments no one was watching. That's what good character actually looks like, not the dramatic gesture, not the public stand, but the accumulation of quiet decisions that build a life other people can lean on. What happened at that restaurant was the consequence of a different set of choices, not one bad night, not one overstepping mother-in-law. It was the result of a pattern. Every small surrender, every time I told myself it was fine, every time Daniel went quiet and I filled the silence with excuses on his behalf. Cause and effect doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like a place card in the wrong corner of a room. The thing I had to reckon with was my own part in it. I'm not someone who lacks intelligence. I saw the signs. I reread them as something else because I wanted to. That's not a failure of perception, it's a failure of honesty, and the two feel completely different until they don't. What I eventually understood is that knowing something and acting on what you know are two entirely separate skills, and the second one takes a kind of courage the first one doesn't. I had to get honest with myself before I could get honest in that parking lot, before I could say in the kitchen with Daniel that I wasn't going to keep adjusting. Before I could sit on a tile floor in January and decide that even in the middle of everything falling apart, I wasn't going to make a unilateral decision that belonged to two people, because that's not who my father raised me to be, and I wasn't going to become someone else just because it would have been easier. What I learned is not something I can reduce to a clean line. It's more like this. The people who shaped me did it through consistency, not drama. Through showing up, not announcing themselves. My grandmother who said she might not make it and then came to every single thing that mattered. My mother with the casseroles left on a doorstep. My father with the safety rating spreadsheet and the note that said probably overthinking it. That is what staying power actually looks like. Not toughness as armor, but persistence as a way of loving people. The willingness to keep doing the right thing even when it costs something, even when no one is watching, even when the room hasn't been arranged the way you wanted. I'm still figuring out what comes next. But I know what I'm building toward. Something that holds. Something that doesn't need to be rearranged when no one's looking. That's enough to start with.